Hello everyone, today we talk about the French commune of Soissons on the Aisne, northeast of Paris. As you know, a considerable part of Schwerpunkt is devoted to the Italian communes, right? But the communal phenomenon is really European, right? Especially the French, the Germans, the Spanish had a very important communal development as well. Just different and more modest, but nevertheless quite important, as we will see today, especially for the building of the local monarchy that exploited the communal phenomenon at the expense of the local lay and ecclesiastical aristocracy. This happened elsewhere, for example in the German communes, in the so-called Freie Reichsstädte, that became essentially a direct referee with the royal and imperial authority. In that case, you have the attempt of creating some enclaves of power that could remain untouched, albeit modestly, within the city walls, as outside traditionally the lay and ecclesiastical princes ruled. But to play on a bit this balance, right? And at some point, importantly enough, in Germany, where it was differently from France, this is in the late Middle Ages, the leagues of cities had an important relevance, right? In Swabia, in the Rhineland, even the same Swiss in part were about that as a urban phenomenon. In France, you don't have this at the end of the day, because the various cities that emerge, especially by the thresholds of the modern ages, the true important provincial centers that are really the power base for the local dominations, are still, however, framed under a seigneurial hegemony, also directly a royal one, right? So we will see that better in other videos. We also talked about this. If you look in the medieval France playlist, you can find some of that, also a brief comparison with England, but not mostly for the cities, because in England that wasn't quite I mean, the only actual city was London for that matter. And that was a hell of a truer and earlier capital than the same Paris for the French. So that's another story, right? And another development, and a different land, also a more nationally compact one. As you know, is that France, the Kingdom of France, emerged as bringing together kind of different nations, or sub nations, if you want. In any case, France didn't have a dramatic communal movement, especially in the north, especially what had been properly the core of the Western Frankish kingdom, in also, if you want, in an ethnic sense, with Neustria, right, and where properly since Merovingian times the affirmation of nobility had been a big deal. Traditionally was Occitania that had an important communal development similar to the one of central northern Italy, with which in fact they had a lot of elements in common, albeit even in southern France what you actually have is the local lords still kind of sharing power with the commune factually. We made a video about the county of Toulouse that is perhaps the best example of that, because Toulouse was, in the sense, the county was the city and the seat of the count itself, before, incidentally, the northern French carried out the Albigensian crusade, etc. And at some point we will talk about other French communes, for example, Paris itself as the most important French city, for many reasons, from the fact that it had, since the time of Philip II, already become de facto capital, right? But had been since Merovingian times one of the main centers of Frankish power, and also in the last generations the French kings had journeyed there for an ever longer time, and would in fact become the modern French capital. From that, it was a big city, also on the Seine, with an important mercantile activity, and so some guilds, especially the marchands de l'eau, right, the merchants of the water, of the Seine, was really also demographically one of the largest cities in Europe, you would think it could, expand importantly also in its communal administration. But naturally, the monarchic lordship on the city blocked this. Right? We've seen something similar talking about Rome exactly in the 12th century that we're talking about today. The same happened with the papal lordship. The city was pretty sizable for medieval standards, but the curial presence brought to, let's say, of an inhibition of the potential that the Roman commune had. And what especially strikes in the case of Paris is the degree of fragmentation, in fact, that actually occurred, because these were different guilds altogether that, in order to reach the communal unity, would have had to cooperate and take on power much more directly, right? And so this was factually not achieved, because even when the Commune of Paris was achieved, right, this was still under an ever firmer monarchic control. And not that Paris, as you know, was that mild. You look at what Etienne Marcel did during the Jacquerie and against the monarchic power. So it's always French masses that do cause problems. Just looking at last night's news, for that matter, it's a recurrent problem. You need a strong authority keeping them under control, but also giving them something, because you can't in exchange, because that's how politics really works at the end of the day. And France managed historically to do it more than once, even in spite of all the upheavals, right? So we are confident it's gonna do well again. And in other areas of France where the seigneurial presence was strong, but still also the towns, if not cities properly, were strong, right? The commune managed to affirm itself. So again, in the hierarchy of medieval powers, what you really have is like an overlord, and then all the rest of the community organizes themselves how they please, right? There's the concept of universitas, from which we have maintained just the university that we know in modern terms. But every single association, medieval times, was known as a university, because it simply means in Latin to be directed towards a common goal, at least if not properly a direction in general. And so this was allowed, right? Because even if you were under a lord, you could factually say, okay, but I still want to organize myself as far as I'm concerned, because still, if you're a freeman, you can, right? And so they were. So today we speak very briefly, it's just a manual example, if you want, about Soissons, that recurs in history. Mostly it's famous because being the capital of Siagr's kingdom, it was one of the residences of the Merovingian kings, etc. It's a city in the northeast of Paris, that as a region, as a province, broadly speaking, did witness an important communal development, right? There were rich areas, right? Very fertile soil, an important demographic concentration. The northeast of France is very overlooked in general when thinking about the developments of the country even in much later times, but starting from the Middle Ages. At this point, it was not a dramatically important center, but still, right, it evolved thanks to the royal policy that, as we've seen, basically allowed these towns to expand further, escaping the pressure of the local aristocracy. Why this was important for the kings? Because, as you know, the Capetians had fundamentally expanded quite gradually, but quite solidly in this area of the Ile-de-France that was also very well administered, very rich, especially had this kind of clay soil, was very fat and fertile and productive, and also the same cathedral building was possible in part because of the qualities of of this ground, and the most immediate interests of the French monarchy, in spite of the threat that naturally was being posed by eventually the Angevin Empire, so towards the Atlantic, towards the west side, let's say, was expanding northeast, because those were the areas of the Champagne that we made a video on the county recently. It was about the very important fairs of that land, but also the connection with the county of Flanders. It was factually part of the Western Frankish kingdom, and that was especially a decentralized area, because Germany was kind of distant in between. There was lots of different smaller powers, if you want. It was not a main center of power. These were the areas of the former Lotharingia that had not witnessed let's say a statal development like in the rest of the other post-Carolingian regions. And albeit the Capetian monarchy, as you know, as it generally was in all the countries, backed by the local church, at the same time, it was seeking to increase the status of the commoners. You'd say, the monarchy, no, because as we've seen many times, monarchies are the most friendly political actors towards the commoners, because the great competitor is the aristocracy, right? So that's exactly what happens. The Capetian kings, of course, couldn't give a damn about the commoners. They thought they were subhuman beings, and that was the universal belief shared by everybody at the time. It's just that, of course, in terms of actual power, this, alleged subhumans were actually powerful en masse. The communal forces, as we've seen, were generally speaking expression of also were hegemonized by the rich mercantile classes. They could arm militias, etc. And this is in fact very underappreciated in the especially in French warfare, because of the elites that produced an historiography that didn't care very much about the infantry, but we know it was pretty much there and was very useful as always. And but I mean present in important numbers also for medieval standards. So in the most feudalized kingdom, you actually have also there, as we've seen often, a communal development. This is the proof, because just France again has this, appallingly enormous demographic and agricultural resources. France is altogether, at least, so not necessarily what the Capetians control now, but the richest and most populated country in Europe at the time. So the lordship, doesn't matter how developed historically in Western Francia, couldn't control everything, and the masses that still had an important role in the same feeding of that hell of aristocracy that the French could deploy. And naturally, the centers were mainly the towns. The countryside was generally disarmed, but the cities flourished in this great and tumultuous phase of expansion that Europe, and especially some of these centers, are witnessing. So at the beginning of the 12th century in Soissons, about which we don't know much, right? We know that the later cathedrals being built, the main buildings being documented from this time onwards. Not surprising. You may wonder, yes, that's the degree of documentation also for some relatively famous cities like Soissons we don't really have in this context. Was, let's say, fragmented in terms of power in different distinct nuclei, right? Which means that there was not a unitary communal rule. And part of the reason why this happened is that, first of all, there is a development, there is an evolution over time. As we've seen north of the Alps, generally speaking, the municipal prerogatives do not last much beyond the Roman times, because there are other types of elites that take over, right? But some of the centers are also initially, in fact, modest, shrinking, but they evolve, they attract people, etc. And the jurisdiction of the city had been granted by the episcopal church that had traditionally ruled in the city, because that's what was the main power, right, that had remained since late Roman times, the bishop. But the bishop had been forced, say, by political ratios of power to grant the jurisdiction of the city feudally to the communal dynasty of Soissons. Right? Originally, it was a Norman branch, then the Nel, but it's important that this ecclesiastical and lay aristocracy had shared power in this, because by effect of ecclesiastical immunities, the quarters were the buildings and the landed assets of the bishopric, of the cathedral chapter, and of the other religious entities, were subtracted from the jurisdiction of the count. In other words, the bishop had shared power with the count, and these were two lordships ruling, good example, two lordships ruling on essentially what was the same public district originally, right? But that had been sub-enfeoffed fundamentally by the bishop that held it traditionally to feudal lord, at least by some degree, right? And this had happened because historically it was important also for the church to establish these clientelar relations, to have some powerful lay aristocracy guarding them in arms and still retaining those episcopal rights on the local church and some prerogatives that had to do with the previous, the previous Romano-Germanic district, right, in the city. And it had always been like that. It was normally a prelate and then a lay lord, right, essentially ruling, sharing power of their pertinences. This had kind of blended in a little more because, as we've seen, there had been some probably sub-enfeoffment of some episcopal prerogatives, right, that in theory were still detained by the local church. The problem is that the people were growing, right, and so the populace was dependent for reasons of residence. Just, if you came to live there, you were within the district ruled by that lord, right? So there was not really another option. And such dependency could be complicated by the eventual personal ties with the count, with the bishop, with the canonic and monastic communities. So, in other words, again, these main lords, the bishop and the count, were, of course, engaging in different contracts, business relations, etc., that could tie in different ways people to their power. Same goes for this canonic and monastic communities that were provided with their own autonomy. So you can imagine also how complicated the superimposition of such allegiances could be, and how much competition there would be, and how much the development of the same commune would stem from these ones, right? Albeit, as we'll see now, with an important external intervention. But again, this is a completely normal picture of what a medieval city fundamentally was. So in such situation, there was an associational movement taking form as essentially a form of resistance against the very different burdens that weighed on its inhabitants, right? That is to say, the competition that was increasing between all the various communities existing within Soissons was also kind of intensifying the pressure on the people at large that were acquiring more power because economy improved, the demography increased, etc. And so, the townsmen were beginning to acquire a bit more of awareness about their own power, their own opportunities. Who was interested in this situation, and he intervened, was the Western Frankish king Louis VI, that in 1136 granted to the citizens of Soissons the right to, quote, make commune, right? Which was a university on its own, and, a sworn allegiance to a common polity. Not the immediate lords, but the king, the supreme lord, promoted a communal jurisdiction through this act, was revealing to be in the act of disintegrating quarter by quarter, literally, the previous jurisdictional fabric, a mean of surpassing the seigneurial fragmentation and of unification of the city from the standpoint of public law. This system is extraordinary if you think about that, because basically the king intervenes in what is already a fragmented reality, right, and makes leverage on a pre-existing, associational phenomenon that was, in this sense, already a commune, right, because the people, again, already organized themselves in some way, right, but here the monarchy comes to sanction that and to fundamentally establish a fil rouge between the crown and that commune that essentially goes past the authority of both the local bishop and count. This tells you naturally how already powerful the Capetian monarchy was in this area, because it really was, right? We always say, oh, look at how the Capetians were still weak at this time compared even to their own vassals. Yes, but in absolute terms, this was a hell of a seigneury already, right? And it was increasing its own power like this, right? Another king, a weaker king, could have not actually exercised this power because it would have lacked the political pressure, the political power in practice to exercise this, to affirm itself like this. And the local aristocracy had to adapt to this, and seeing the commune rising, essentially at their own expense, albeit still the entire system is ever under the bigger aristocracy, the top one, the monarchic one, right? And gradually, this is just an example. The case of Soissons is part of a more general politics of the kings of France towards communal movement. Louis VI, Louis VII, also Philip II will do really a lot, and we will see it in other videos. Today, I really wanted to talk about Soissons. And this shows you how we've seen it recently in many videos, right? Just the other day, we were, for example, picking the Norman Kingdom of Sicily and saying how could, let's say, more developed powers like the bigger monarchies like these ones, France, England, Sicily, Castile, etc., could actually make it in a world that didn't know juridically any other logic but the idea that there was somebody stronger that was strong because it was, first of all, clearly recognized that without the decisive moral support of the population, he couldn't rule, because he had to prove that, right? It had to be real power, God-given power. And in this case, it was not just because of the ideological overload of the Western Frankish monarchy, and properly the one of blood that the Capetians were also embodying so beautifully, but properly the real capacity of exercising this power. And in France also will grow as a cultural norm, as opposed to England, that instead was much more restrictive towards sovereigns prerogatives. But well, this is the point. If you have so many communities that are all maintaining their own prerogatives, this is the ancien regime, as it had always existed, right? This was the same system also, say, in the Roman Empire, whatever system would think as statal and centralized, but that factually rested before the Code Napoleon in the early 19th century on the idea that it was the communities that made power, not the other way around. Like we're more habituated to think today, and wrongly so, because the system didn't actually change, right? We just apostatized the concept of state, but it's not that politics works differently from there on, and that's why the Middle Ages are so important now, especially now, more than ever, arguably. This post-ancien regime times, nation-state times, but exactly it's competing, making these communities competing among each other. If you have multiple communities, like in this case, you have a balance that is precarious, you just intervene in it, right? You add that force that is, enough essentially to make the, say, gaining support of the side that fundamentally will gain power locally, but that you will keep, contained enough to be, again, as a tool to check the power of the local competitors, but that will not be large enough to expand it at your own expenses, which is also difficult. Maintaining this balance is difficult. Okay, well, Soissons could have not really changed the balance of the Western Frankish kingdom. But also, let's not, underestimate what also achieving, control of this a single town, just like this one, could actually mean. Soissons would expand dramatically, would be a beautiful cathedral, would become one very important center. It was very symbolic, because as it was in Soissons that Pepin III the Short was proclaimed the first Carolingian king in 751. The Capetians had fundamentally stepped in after them. But the same Clovis had crushed the last Romans of Syagrius in Soissons. So it was really a crucial symbol, right? And as I was saying, at the beginning of the 12th century, the skyrocketing of the city is witnessed also by the building of the Romanesque nave in the first cathedral that is not really, we don't know really when it was begun. We're talking about, however, this one in the 30s, the 40s of the century. And also in the 50s, there is the early Gothic dwarf. So this, there was a transept built in the 70s, between the 70s and the 90s. And so we're talking about as you know, in the cathedrals, and especially massively in the French ones in this early time, you see literally the power of the soil, the power of, in this sense, of the town, the chthonic element, the commoners, etc. But that brought in this enormous material force for the elites, the Apollonian, the Uranic ones, to elevate the kingdom also properly to the sky, to heaven, through this enormous amount of wealth and power embodied by the cathedral. So you understand how rich the commune was already by itself to afford even the building of the cathedral, among other things. Of course, there was a lot of royal, episcopal, and other lay contributions in this, and theirs was enormous. But for the city was everything, because it was a forever ongoing working site that gave work to people. It made other people come in the city, would pay taxes and consume and and so expanding further also the power of the same communal elites, right? So it's not an accident that also Louis XVI steps in, because there was a lot of timing involved, right? If these associational forms had been put down in a struggle, etc., there would have been a lost opportunity for the monarchy as well. So it's a bit like all this mechanism forever ongoing. And again, Soissons is very typical of the broader French development, and I'm glad we could talk about it today, because it really shows how gradually, but also how impactingly, after all, and how conflictually, the same order that we are habituated to enjoy, right, was built historically, and you don't have to give for granted. Alright, so we will talk about lots of other European communes, aside, of course, from the main, say, manual chapter topic of the Italian ones, because, again, not just as a term of comparison, but also because, of course, they reflect a bit the broader political, also military, and social characteristics of the kingdoms where these were developing. I created recently also a new playlist known as Medieval Cities, so that never done that, so it can hopefully attract some kind of bit of algorithmic views. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.